When I first saw apartment 7B, it felt like a stroke of luck. The ad had caught my eye. Charming pre-war building. Affordable. Quiet tenants. No pets. No parties. No exceptions. I ignored the draconian tone because the rent was well within my budget, a rarity in this city where living alone often meant taking up residence in a shoebox. The building stood at the end of a cobblestone street, its facade cloaked in ivy that curled around arched windows like green veins. As I approached for the showing, the fading light of twilight bathed the structure in a golden glow, masking the cracks in its foundation and the grime that clung to its bricks. It had character, I told myself. Inside the apartment was a time capsule. Parquet floors, crown moldings, a clawfoot tub that practically begged for bubble baths. But something about the place felt heavy. The air seemed thicker, and the faint hum of the city outside faded the moment I stepped inside, replaced by a strange, expectant quiet. "It's a bargain," said the landlord, a wiry man with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But there is one rule you must follow." I raised an eyebrow. "No loud music. No smoking." He shook his head, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the clipboard. "Never leave the curtains open after sunset." The statement hung in the air like a cobweb, sticky and impossible to ignore. "Why?" I asked, half laughing to dispel the unease creeping up my spine. "Just don't," he said, his tone firm, his gaze darting towards the windows as if they might spring open of their own accord. "It's for your safety." I wanted to press further, but the lease was already in his outstretched hand, a pen clipped neatly to the top. My practical side took over. A weird curtain rule wasn't enough to make me pass up such a steal. That night, as I unpacked my things, the rule echoed in my mind. I shut the curtains tightly before the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching from the street below. By the end of my first week in apartment 7B, I had settled into a comfortable routine. The neighborhood was quiet, the other tenants polite but distant, and the subway station was just a 10-minute walk away. For the most part, I was content. But then the strange disturbances began. At first, they were small enough to ignore. A creak in the floorboards, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. Old buildings made noise, I told myself. It was probably just the pipes settling or mice scurrying between the walls. Then, one night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't dismiss so easily. It was a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was bathed in the faint glow of a street lamp outside, filtered through the edges of the tightly drawn curtains. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. I lay back down, laughing at myself. I was being ridiculous, letting the landlord's cryptic warning get to me. But when I turned my head toward the ceiling, I froze. A shadow stretched across the plaster, faint and blurry, like something standing in the center of the room. My gaze darted to the floor, half expecting to see a figure there, but it was empty. The shadow remained. I stared at it, my pulse racing. Slowly, I raised my hand, waving it in front of me to see if the shadow would mimic my movements. It didn't. Instead, it shifted. The blurry edges trembled, almost imperceptibly, before the shadow bent unnaturally, elongating until it disappeared into the far corner of the ceiling. I sat there, paralyzed, my breath shallow as I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light. The next morning, I checked the curtains first thing, making sure they were still closed. They were. I told myself that whatever I'd seen was a product of exhaustion, of my overactive imagination in an unfamiliar place. But the disturbances didn't stop. Over the next few nights, I noticed other small but unsettling changes. Objects seemed to move when I wasn't looking. A book I had left on the coffee table would appear on the kitchen counter, or a chair I had pushed against the wall would be slightly askew. Once, I found the bathroom faucet running, though I hadn't touched it since the morning. I started double-checking everything, making sure windows were locked, chairs were straight, and faucets were off. It didn't help. And then, one evening, I noticed something truly strange. As I pulled the curtains closed just before dusk, I caught a glimpse of the apartment in the reflection of the glass. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw movement behind me. A faint flicker, like someone walking past the doorway to the bedroom. When I turned, the room was empty. But when I glanced back at the glass, the faint impression of a figure remained, just for an instant, before fading into the gathering shadows. My hands trembled as I shut the curtains tightly. Whatever this was, I wasn't imagining it. Apartment 7B was hiding something that only stirred when the sun disappeared. And it was getting bolder. By the second week, the disturbances had become impossible to ignore. Objects no longer moved. They disappeared entirely, only to reappear in bizarre places. My keys once turned up inside the freezer, covered in frost. A favorite book I had left on my nightstand appeared under the sink. Worse still were the shadows. They no longer confined themselves to the ceiling. I began to see them flicker along the walls, slithering across the floor in the corner of my eye. Whenever I turned to look directly, they vanished, as if retreating just beyond the edge of perception. I began to dread sunset. Every evening, as the last rays of light filtered through the curtains, the apartment grew cold, and the oppressive stillness returned. It was as though the air itself became denser, heavier, making it hard to breathe. I tried to distract myself by staying busy, cleaning, rearranging furniture, reading, but nothing could keep the unease at bay. One night, after double-checking the curtains and locks, I stayed up until dawn, determined to observe whatever might be happening. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I sat on the couch, my eyes darting from one corner of the room to another, waiting for something, anything, to happen. As the hours stretched on, the apartment was eerily quiet. Not even the usual groan of the floorboards or the faint hum of the refrigerator interrupted the silence. My eyelids grew heavy, and I fought to stay awake. Around 3 a.m., the scratching began. It was faint at first, a barely audible noise coming from the far corner of the living room. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as if nails were raking against the wooden floorboards. My heart pounded as I aimed the beam of light toward the source. Nothing. The room was empty. But when I turned off the flashlight, I saw them, marks etched into the floor, faint but unmistakable. They hadn't been there before. By the time the first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains, the marks were gone, as if they had never existed. The next day, I decided to investigate. I spent hours online searching for anything that could explain what was happening. Urban legends, hauntings, even rare psychological conditions. I scoured every source, desperate for answers. That's when I stumbled upon a local history forum. The building had a reputation. Decades ago, Apartment 7B had been the site of unexplained disappearances. Tenants often broke their leases within weeks, citing strange noises and unsettling shadows. The most chilling detail, though, was a single thread on the forum. The curtain rule. One user described living in the apartment for a month. They claimed the landlord's warning was no mere eccentricity. The rule, they said, was a barrier, a way to keep whatever lurked in the apartment at bay. They'd followed it religiously, but the disturbances still escalated until they finally moved out. The post ended with a cryptic warning. Whatever you do, don't let it in. That night, as the sun set, I found myself staring at the curtains, my pulse racing. The room seemed darker than usual, the corners shrouded in impenetrable shadows. My reflection in the window was faint, distorted. Unable to stand it any longer, I flung the curtains open. For a moment, the apartment was bathed in the orange glow of twilight. I half expected to see something standing outside the window, but the street below was empty, serene. Then, as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The shadows moved. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching as the shadows pooled together in the center of the room, coalescing into something almost tangible. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it at the dark mass, but the beam seemed to bend around it, swallowed by an unnatural void. The air grew thick with an oppressive hum, a sound too low to hear, but one I could feel in my chest, vibrating through my bones. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a shape began to emerge. It wasn't a person, not entirely. It was a silhouette, humanoid but warped, its edges flickering like smoke caught in a breeze. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying me. The hum intensified, and though the figure made no sound, I felt words pressing into my mind. "You stayed." The room spun, my knees threatening to buckle. What do you want?" "A choice," it whispered, though the words weren't spoken aloud. They resonated in my head, cold and invasive. "A choice," I repeated, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the shadows around it writhed, snaking across the floor toward me. "Leave or stay. Replace me." I shook my head, stumbling back against the wall. "Replace you? What are you talking about?" The shadows paused, quivering as if amused. "I was once like you. Tenant, invited, trapped." I didn't understand. My mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning behind its cryptic words. You were human?" It didn't respond. Instead, the shadows began to recede, pulling back toward the figure. "Decide." The figure dissolved into darkness, and the room fell silent. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching the shadows with an unblinking gaze. When the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, the apartment felt lighter, but the dread in my chest remained. Whatever I had unleashed wasn't gone. It was waiting, and I had a choice to make. The next morning, sunlight poured through the apartment's windows, a golden reprieve that felt too fragile to last. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the curtains I had so recklessly thrown open the night before. The room now seemed almost mundane, a collection of furniture and belongings rendered harmless in the daylight. But I couldn't shake the memory of the figure, or the weight of its words. Leave or stay. Replace me. The apartment was alive in a way that defied reason. It had rules, rhythms, and something lurking just out of sight. Whatever it was, it had been here before me, bound to the space by rules I'd nearly broken. And now, it had offered me a decision, one that felt less like a choice and more like a trap. I spent the day packing, throwing clothes into a suitcase with frantic determination. If I left immediately, I could pretend the whole thing had been a bad dream, a lapse in judgment brought on by an old building's creaks and groans. But the moment the sun dipped toward the horizon, the air in the apartment changed. The hum returned, faint and insistent, vibrating through the walls and floor. My breath quickened as the sunlight began to retreat, golden hues replaced by a cold gray dusk. I stood frozen, my suitcase half-zipped, as the shadows gathered in the corners of the room like spectators waiting for a show. "You're not real," I muttered, trying to convince myself more than anything else. The shadows trembled, shifting as though responding to my words. When the last rays of light vanished beyond the horizon, the apartment fell into an oppressive silence. The hum grew louder, filling the space like an invisible tide. And then, It was there again, the figure. It emerged from the darkness, its edges flickering like firelight reflected in water. It was taller this time, more defined, though its face, or where a face should have been, remained an impenetrable void. The air around it pulsed with a presence that was neither malevolent nor benevolent, but wholly indifferent, as though I were an insect caught under a magnifying glass. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice trembling. "You can keep your apartment. I'm not staying." The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. "You cannot leave so easily." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping back until my heels hit the wall. "You invited me. You opened the curtains. You let me see." The realization hit me like a gust of icy wind. By breaking the rule, I had done more than disrupt the delicate balance of the apartment. I had become part of its design, tethered to its unseen mechanisms. "What happens if I leave?" I whispered. The figure didn't answer. It only stood there, a dark, imposing silhouette that radiated an almost imperceptible hunger. Panic clawed at me, but a strange clarity surfaced in the chaos. If the apartment was a trap, then the rules were my only protection. I couldn't undo the damage I'd done, but maybe I could restore the balance. I reached for the curtains, yanking them shut with shaking hands. The sound of the fabric scraping against the rod felt deafening in the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure remained, its presence a suffocating weight in the room. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it began to dissolve. The shadows retreated, shrinking into the corners like smoke curling into itself. The hum faded, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I collapsed onto the bed, my heart pounding. The apartment felt empty again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a curtain drawn back to reveal an empty stage. The next morning, I left. As I handed the keys back to the landlord, he studied me with the same detached curiosity I had noticed the day I moved in. "You lasted longer than most," he said, his tone almost impressed. I wanted to demand answers, to scream at him for not warning me properly, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I walked away, my suitcase rattling behind me. Even now, in a new apartment miles away, I can't shake the feeling that apartment 7B is still watching, waiting for its next tenant. The hum sometimes finds me in the quiet hours of the night, and I double-check every curtain before I sleep. I never open them after sunset.